What did it really take to scandalize old Hollywood? It wasn't nudity. It wasn't profanity. Sometimes it was just a dress. Beneath the silk, satin, and carefully posed studio portraits, a single neckline or the way fabric moved could trigger censorship panic and whispered outrage. In the Golden Age, vulgar meant defiance. Against morality clauses, religious watchdogs, and strict rules placed almost entirely on women. These dresses weren't shocking for attention. They were quiet rebellions, stitched into glamour, daring audiences to see what Hollywood tried to hide. Mae West, the body-clinging gowns that changed censorship. Mae West didn't just wear provocative dresses, she weaponized them. In the early 1930s, West appeared in gowns that hugged every curve, dipped low across the chest, and clung unapologetically to the body. These weren't accidents of tailoring. They were deliberate choices designed to draw attention to female sexuality at a time when that idea alone was considered dangerous. Studio executives tolerated her wardrobe only because it made money. Moral reform groups, however, saw something far more threatening. West's dresses didn't suggest innocence. They suggested awareness, desire, control. Critics complained that her costumes turned suggestion into declaration. What truly alarmed censors wasn't exposed skin, but confidence. West's gowns made it clear that she was not being looked at. She was inviting the gaze on her own terms. Within a few years, her wardrobe would become one of the unspoken reasons the Hays Code was enforced with ruthless precision. Jean Harlow. Satin. That was too honest. Jean Harlow's dresses were often described as poured on, rather than worn, and that description was not meant as praise. Her bias-cut satin gowns clung to her figure under studio lighting, revealing movement, curves, and physical presence in a way audiences were not accustomed to seeing. The fabric did not conceal or soften. It followed her body honestly, leaving little room for illusion. Religious groups and conservative columnists accused her wardrobe of being indecent, even though it technically covered everything required by studio guidelines. The issue was not exposure. It was realism. The material responded to her body, making it impossible to pretend she did not have one. In a culture built on denial, that clarity was deeply unsettling. Hollywood worked hard to frame Harlow as playful and harmless, emphasizing charm over sensuality. But her dresses betrayed that narrative. They reminded viewers that desire existed and did not need to be hidden. By the standards of the time, that reminder alone was enough to make her wardrobe vulgar. Marlene Dietrich. When trousers became a scandal. Marlene Dietrich shocked audiences not by revealing skin, but by rejecting femininity altogether. Her tailored suits, tuxedos, and leg-revealing costumes caused outrage because they disrupted expectations that had nothing to do with modesty. To many viewers, a woman in trousers was more disturbing than a woman draped in silk. Dietrich's wardrobe erased clear distinctions. It blended masculinity and femininity in ways that made audiences uneasy. Studio publicists attempted to dismiss the discomfort as European sophistication, suggesting foreign elegance rather than defiance. But the reaction was too strong to explain away so easily. Her clothing implied authority, choice, and sexual ambiguity, ideas Hollywood preferred to keep invisible. There was no reassurance built into her image, no apology offered. In a system that relied on clearly defined roles and carefully maintained illusions, that refusal was threatening. Dietrich's wardrobe was considered vulgar precisely because it did not explain itself. It existed on its own terms, leaving audiences without the comfort of moral clarity. Clara Bow, the flapper dresses that alarmed America. Clara Bow's dresses became symbols of generational panic. High hemlines, thin straps, and open backs transformed her into the embodiment of everything conservative America feared about modern womanhood. Church groups and moral reformers blamed flapper fashion for social decline, and Bow became its most visible target. Her dresses moved when she moved. They revealed legs during dancing, running, and laughter, creating a sense of freedom that critics described as reckless rather than joyful. The concern was not indecency in a technical sense, but momentum. Bow's clothing suggested a woman unrestrained by caution or fear. What troubled audiences most was the ease with which she wore them. There was no effort to signal shame or restraint. Her wardrobe felt lived in, not posed. In truth, Bow's dresses represented independence. But in the 1920s, independence in a woman was often labeled vulgar long before it was ever understood or accepted. Rita Hayworth. The dress that moved too much. The black gown worn by Rita Hayworth and Gilda was never banned. It passed censorship. It followed the rules. And yet, it terrified studio executives. The danger lay not in exposure, but in motion. The fabric emphasized hips, shoulders, and posture in ways that responded directly to movement. Combined with deliberate choreography, the dress transformed a simple performance into something critics described as suggestive without being explicit. The effect lingered longer than any moment of exposed skin ever could. Censors worried less about what audiences saw and more about what they felt. The dress did not expose the body. It exposed intention. It suggested awareness, control, and invitation, all without violating a single guideline. For its time, that implication was enough to provoke alarm. The gown demonstrated how restraint could be undermined not by nudity, but by confidence. And in the moral framework of the era, confidence itself was often treated as danger. Ava Gardner. Dresses that refused apology. Ava Gardner's gowns were frequently criticized for being too tight or too revealing, even though they followed studio regulations to the letter. Nothing about them was technically improper. What unsettled audiences was how little she tried to soften their effect. There was no strategic modesty, no visual compromise meant to reassure nervous viewers. The dresses fit her body honestly, and that honesty became the problem. Gardner did not hide behind ruffles or illusion. Her posture, movement, and comfort in her own skin made the clothing feel intentional rather than accidental. Columnists accused her wardrobe of lacking shame, a word often used when women appeared too comfortable with their physical presence. The accusation had less to do with fabric and more to do with attitude. In a culture that equated virtue with restraint, Gardner's dresses seemed to reject apology entirely. They did not pretend innocence or invite moral reassurance. Instead, they presented beauty without explanation. For many observers, that refusal to soften, deny, or disguise became enough to label her wardrobe vulgar, even when it broke no rules at all. Tallulah Bankhead. Backless gowns and studio panic. Tallulah Bankhead's dresses caused anxiety, not because they were glamorous, but because they were defiant. Deeply backless gowns, high slits, and her well-known refusal to wear undergarments left costume departments in a constant state of unease. Executives worried about accidental exposure, but Bankhead showed little concern for their fears. What made her wardrobe especially troubling was her attitude toward it. She did not frame her choices as seductive or playful. She treated them as practical, personal decisions. That refusal to perform modesty unsettled an industry built on appearances. Bankhead's dresses challenged the assumption that respectability should always outweigh comfort or self-expression. For studio heads, the danger was not what audiences might see, but what they might sense. A woman unconcerned with propriety was far more threatening than a woman carefully pretending to obey it. Long before her dresses were celebrated as bold or modern, they were condemned as vulgar simply because they suggested independence rather than restraint. Theda Bara. Exotic costumes that terrified moral reformers. Theda Bara's costumes were considered dangerous in a way that went beyond modesty. Bare midriffs, heavy ornamentation, and so-called exotic styling triggered fears that had little to do with fabric and everything to do with symbolism. Religious leaders and moral reformers condemned her wardrobe as pagan, corrupting, and morally destabilizing. To them, Bara's costumes represented foreign influence, unchecked desire, and the collapse of traditional values. Her clothing did not resemble everyday fashion, which made it easier to label as threatening. In reality, these costumes were theatrical fantasies designed to convey power, mystery, and dominance on screen. But in an era deeply suspicious of anything unfamiliar, symbolism itself became evidence of danger. Bara's wardrobe did not ask to be understood. It existed on its own terms. That autonomy, paired with visual excess, made her costumes a lightning rod for outrage. They were labeled vulgar, not because they revealed too much skin, but because they represented a woman who did not belong to the moral order audiences were taught to trust. Joan Crawford, power dressing that made men uneasy. Joan Crawford's dresses were rarely soft, and that was precisely what disturbed critics. Her sharply structured gowns emphasized shoulders, waist, and posture in ways described as aggressive rather than elegant. These dresses projected authority, control, and intention, qualities not traditionally encouraged in female stars. Crawford's wardrobe did not exist to flatter quietly. It shaped her presence, giving her physical dominance within the frame. In an industry that preferred women to appear decorative rather than commanding, this visual assertiveness was deeply unsettling. Studio executives worried that her silhouette conveyed power instead of desirability. Nothing about her clothing violated censorship rules. There were no excessive slits or exposed skin. The concern was symbolic. Her dresses suggested a woman who occupied space confidently and without apology. For conservative observers, that confidence alone crossed into vulgar territory. Crawford's wardrobe didn't invite admiration. It demanded recognition. And in a culture uncomfortable with women who appeared authoritative, that demand was often mistaken for indecency. Carole Lombard, high slits and physical comedy. Carole Lombard's dresses were considered dangerous because they moved. In screwball comedies, her gowns often featured high slits and flowing skirts that revealed legs during fast-paced physical scenes. The exposure was brief, accidental, and unscripted, which made it more troubling to censors than deliberate seduction. Hollywood preferred controlled glamour, poses held, movements planned, bodies carefully managed. Lombard's wardrobe disrupted that order. Laughter, motion, and spontaneity created moments where the body was revealed without warning. Moral watchdogs viewed this unpredictability as irresponsible. The concern was not nudity. It was loss of control. Lombard's dresses suggested freedom rather than calculated allure, and that distinction mattered deeply. Clothing that moved naturally implied a woman who could not be fully managed. In an industry obsessed with precision, Lombard's wardrobe represented chaos, and chaos, when associated with female autonomy, was often labeled vulgar long before it was understood as joyful or liberating. Barbara Stanwyck, dresses that looked too real. Barbara Stanwyck's costumes were frequently criticized for being unromantic. Her fitted dresses emphasized practicality over fantasy, outlining a working woman's body rather than an idealized figure shaped by illusion. Critics complained they were unflattering, a term often used to disguise deeper discomfort. Stanwyck's wardrobe acknowledged reality. Her clothes suggested movement, labor, and strength rather than delicate ornamentation. In a system built on glamour and escape, realism itself was considered suspect. Audiences were expected to admire fantasy, not recognize themselves. Her dresses reminded viewers that women had bodies shaped by experience, not just lighting and lace. That acknowledgement disrupted the carefully curated illusion Hollywood relied on. For moral observers, realism blurred boundaries. If a woman's body looked lived in rather than decorative, it challenged expectations of femininity. Stanwyck's wardrobe was labeled vulgar, not because it revealed too much, but because it refused to pretend life left no mark at all. Hedy Lamarr, exotic gowns and intellectual fear. Hedy Lamarr's dresses were often labeled indecent, not because of exposure, but because of association. Tight gowns, bare shoulders, and foreign styling fed Hollywood's anxiety about the so-called dangerous woman. She was beautiful, intelligent, and visibly aware of both qualities. Her wardrobe suggested mystery rather than innocence. In the moral logic of the era, mystery implied sexuality, and sexuality implied threat. Lamarr's dresses did not reassure audiences of purity or passivity. They hinted at depth, intention, and self-knowledge. What made this especially unsettling was her intellect. A woman who was both visually striking and mentally formidable disrupted Hollywood's preferred hierarchy. Her clothing became a convenient target for that discomfort. Long before her scientific achievements were acknowledged, Lamarr's wardrobe was criticized as provocative, not because it showed too much skin, but because it suggested a woman who could not be easily controlled or simplified. Lana Turner. Clothing that hugged too closely. Lana Turner's dresses caused alarm, not for what they revealed, but for how clearly they defined her shape. Her fitted clothing emphasized curves so directly that critics accused studios of encouraging indecency. The term sweater girl itself reflected moral discomfort with a body that could not be disguised. Nothing was exposed. Everything was suggested. The fabric followed her form honestly, leaving little room for denial. In a culture invested in pretending desire did not exist, this clarity felt confrontational. Turner's wardrobe removed plausible innocence. Viewers could no longer pretend they were unaware of the female body. For moral reformers, that awareness alone was dangerous. Her dresses did not invite imagination. They confirmed reality. And for a society obsessed with restraint and denial, confirmation was far more troubling than exposure. That is why her wardrobe was labeled vulgar, despite adhering to every official rule. Anne Dvorak, pre-code dresses that went too far. Anne Dvorak benefited briefly from the freedom of the pre-code era. Her dresses featured low necklines, bare shoulders, and relaxed silhouettes that openly acknowledged female desire. During that short window, such clothing was encouraged rather than punished. When censorship tightened, the same dresses became evidence of moral recklessness. Studios quickly distanced themselves, reframing once approved wardrobe choices as personal excess. Responsibility shifted quietly from the system to the actress. Dvorak's clothing became a reminder of a freedom Hollywood wanted to erase. What had once been fashionable was suddenly unacceptable. Her image no longer fit the revised moral narrative. These dresses were not just garments. They became symbols of a brief period when women were allowed visibility without apology. When that period ended, Dvorak's wardrobe was condemned as vulgar, not because standards had changed naturally, but because control had returned. Greta Garbo. Simplicity that refused ornament. Greta Garbo's dresses disturbed audiences precisely because they were so restrained. Plain, minimal, and unadorned, her clothing rejected decorative femininity entirely. Clean lines and covered skin created a presence critics described as cold, distant, and unsettling. Her wardrobe did not exist to please or invite. It established boundaries. In a system that equated femininity with accessibility, Garbo's refusal to decorate herself was viewed as defiant. The absence of ornament became its own statement. Her dresses controlled desire rather than encouraging it. That control unsettled audiences more than overt sexuality ever could. Paradoxically, restraint itself became vulgar. Garbo's wardrobe denied the audience emotional and visual access, reminding them that admiration was not a right. In old Hollywood, that denial was one of the most radical gestures a woman could make. These dresses were never just fabric and thread. They were warnings, challenges, and quiet refusals stitched into glamour. In an era obsessed with control, even a silhouette could provoke fear. What once sparked outrage now reveals something deeper: the tension between image and autonomy. Old Hollywood may have sold elegance, but beneath it lived rebellion, expressed not in words, but in what women dared to wear.